I am Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us for our program today called Listening to America. Today's event is in partnership with the Bob Woodruff Foundation, and I'd like to thank that foundation for its support today. The Biden-Harris administration has taken office at a particularly challenging moment in the history of the country. The electorate is deeply divided. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to eliminate structural racism, inequities of all sorts, a pandemic that has killed more than 400,000 Americans as we air this, and the number is going higher. The vaccine rollout has been much slower than expected, and the economy continues to be on shaky ground. The challenges are clear and daunting. However, the old adage that all politics is local still applies. The perspectives of constituents, local governments, and jurisdictions have never been more important. So in addition to national issues, what are the concerns of citizens in communities small and large, rural and urban? What do they want the Biden administration to focus on? How do they want Washington to lead, if it will lead? We'll find out from a fantastic lineup of speakers, governors, mayors, community leaders. But before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag The Hill America. That may be the coolest hashtag we've ever had. We're broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, please refresh the page. They tell me, I don't believe them, but they say that'll be a quick fix. Our first guest is an entrepreneur, an educational leader, and a public servant. He started his first business while in college, and by the time he was 30, he'd launched 3 successful companies. During his time in Congress, the Center for Effective Lawmaking ranked him the most effective member of Colorado's House delegation due to his success in working across the aisle to improve Colorado's schools, protect public lands, support startups, and small businesses. He took over as governor of Colorado in 2019. Welcome, Governor Jared Polis. It's great to be with you and talk to you. I've always enjoyed our conversations. But one of the things we're doing right now was inspired by a conversation I had with then Vice President Biden in 2016. He said to me, Steve, we're not listening to the country. The Democrats have become a party of snobs. We're too far away from people and having them understand we hear them and feel their pain. So I want to just ask you, you're a successful politician, governor, businessman. What are we not hearing in Washington now that you think most needs to be heard?
Well, this is a welcome direction, Steve, and thanks for having me on. Certainly, when I was in the United States Congress, I listened closely to our local elected officials, commissioners, mayors, our governor. And I think it's great that those voices are being elevated now with this forum and many others in Washington. Why? Because while the federal government with the pandemic is playing a coordinating role, it's really on the ground in the states, in the cities, where it's playing out, how we're organizing vaccination clinics, how we're surging our medical capacity, how we're implementing social distancing. Of course, it's better now with the Biden administration to have that strong across-the-board support for science-based measures, but it plays out differently in every area, and it's really important to be attentive to the needs of each community.
I mean, right now, people feel like this is a moment of reset. I feel like it's a moment of whiplash, that if you watch Washington, the wall has been stopped, the Muslim ban is over, environmental regulations are being reversed, and all of this done by executive order. When you kind of look at this, and you're somebody that I've always looked at that has a solid foot in kind of the pragmatic business world, which has helped inform a lot of this, as you kind of look at these straddles that need to happen in Colorado, but also nationally, so that it's not just whiplash, but that we get something where both sides feel they're, in the equation that matters. What would be some of the things you'd recommend?
Well, in Colorado, we had a special session around a stimulus, and we had Republicans and Democrats really coming together on the measures. It provided tax relief for small businesses, help for food banks, renters assistance, and it passed with overwhelming support from both sides. I'd love to see the same sort of work together on the next stimulus bill in Washington. I think that there's certainly a lot of support for the additional $1,400 payments to folks on both sides of the aisle. But I think there's a lot more that we can find in common when both sides work together to get it done.
In education, which is another key priority, the president has talked a lot about getting kids back in school, particularly K through 8, getting the health guardrails, getting the supplies and money and support to schools that are there. I mean, part of your responsibility, I think, in the state of Colorado is educating children. What do you think we need to do, and in terms, again, hearing those stakeholders in education? What do we need to get right? What would be the blind spots?
Yeah, so I mean, the data is clear that schools and kids going to schools and the work environment for teachers is a relatively low risk environment compared to many other things that are occurring in the pandemic. What we've done is we've created a system of layered protection in our schools, meaning, and we've had a majority of our school districts back this school year. Some are still in the process of they're only back for early grades, but many are back for most grades. It's really about symptom checks. It's about mask wearing. It's about ventilation. It's about distancing. We provided free masks to teachers, medical grade masks if they want them. Many don't. They just want the surgical masks or the cloth masks. If they are worried about the virus, they can wear the highly effective, KN95 masks. So it's really about all of that to make sure that parents and teachers know that compared to other things in the pandemic, in-school learning is a safe environment. Now, that being said, it's not for everybody at this time. And I get it if there's a kid who lives with their grandparents or great-grandparents and they're in their 70s and they're doing everything they can to reduce risk in the final days of the pandemic until they're vaccinated, they might want to continue with online education. And that's an important choice for many families too.
Governor Jared, you've sat in a lot of different positions, and when I was knowing that we were going to have this conversation, but yet I was thinking about January 6th and what happened to the Capitol, and I've interviewed you up in the Capitol before, and I imagine that you thought about being one of those members of Congress that was going to have to deal with who knows what. I guess when you sit now as a governor in such an important state like Colorado and you look at that moment, how does it make you feel? What should Americans that are watching this right now understand about that moment and that tension?
Yeah, I think for anybody in and around the Capitol community, and you are, Steve, and my former colleagues, to see the couch from the speaker's lobby and being wedged against the door. This is the area that every day you go through to vote, how close people got to that floor. In fact, were it not for the brave act of some of the officers, the floor might have been penetrated while the members were there. That was scary. I mean, that was scary. It was a wake-up call. It was extremely upsetting to the entire nation because of what the Capitol symbolizes. But of course, in particular, to those of us who, including members of the press corps, members of Congress and their staff, who have really worked in those corridors day in and day out.
Is it complicated for you? And I know you're not responsible for what members of the Colorado delegation do or feel are right. I mean, you have your role, they have their roles, but it sort of talks about the great gaps and divides in the nation when you have one representative from Colorado, I think it's Colorado 3, who has been, someone who has been actually charged with helping to incite this, giving tours to folks there, talking about carrying a gun onto the floor of the House. I guess my question, and I hope it's not unfair, is how do we, I also have a place in Colorado. I know a lot of these folks. How do we begin to get something where both sides aren't just trying to spit at each other and they're actually trying to understand each other and move forward in a way that's less toxic?
Colorado is no different than the country as a whole, Steve. We have great divides in our state and in our nation. We have a new congresswoman who unseated a 10-year Republican, Scott Tipton, in a Republican primary and prevailed in the general. And she's making waves from her perspective in Washington. And there's certainly some Coloradans that agree and disagree with what she's been doing. I think it starts with sitting down and listening to one another. I really applaud the work of the Problem Solvers Caucus. I was a member when I was there. I think it's a very productive enterprise. There's other cross-aisle caucuses as well. I think it begins with, just like we try to in broader society, in our families, in our friends network, listen to people with other perspectives. It's really the professional responsibility of our elected officials to do that. Even have those hard conversations, however unpleasant they are, try to understand, listen, and try to find some middle ground that can pull us back together as a country.
Well, thank you for that. I know it's got to be tough for everybody involved in these equations and making them square. President Biden this week said, look, we're going to have 500,000 people dead in this nation from COVID-19 within another month. It's just a staggering thing to hear out loud. And I guess my question to you is, when you think about the disruption that is caused, when you think about businesses and restaurants and other places that are barely surviving or that have been wiped out, and I guess, sometimes we can be in certain parts of the country and, we may be getting our food delivered and things going well, but there's another dimension to this which is so systemic. And I wonder if we're hearing that loudly enough at this moment. And sitting in the governor's office and responding to folks whose lives and businesses have been turned upside down, what do they most need right now?
This is a multi-dimensional tragedy, right? We focus on the health tragedy, and first and foremost, over 410,000 Americans who have died from the deadly virus. We've lost over 4,500 people in Colorado. Secondly, the economic crisis, people who are struggling to put food on the table, who aren't able to work in nightclubs or in restaurants in some states. They're open in Colorado, but in some states during the pandemic. And then beyond that, Steve, it's the social, emotional, psychological crisis, right? It's not just about, for instance, nightclubs as businesses. It's about who went there every night and seeing people. It's about churches with packed pews and our seniors not having that camaraderie at senior homes, about poker night and movie night in the golden years of their life, or being able to simply see their grandkids and extended family. So there's a price across society. Health first and foremost. For the 410,000 people we lost, there is no tomorrow. The jobs will come back, the economy will grow, and yes, state and local and federal government has a role in helping move that along. But we shouldn't underestimate the social, emotional, and psychological toll that this has caused on the American people and the people of the world.
Well, Governor Jared Polis of the great state of Colorado, thank you for helping to anchor this program today as we try to go around to a lot of different corners of America and hear what the priorities are. Thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Steve. Take care.
When it comes to the towns and cities of our country, small and large jurisdictions have very different concerns. How are local leaders prioritizing at a time of multiple challenges and multiple stresses about what their expectations from leaders in the nation's capital ought to be? Our next two guests can offer their daily experiences as mayors. One oversees a city of nearly 400,000 people. It's a lot of folks. She should be in Congress. And the other town of just over 10,000. Maybe he should be in Congress too. LaToya Cantrell is the mayor of New Orleans. Javier Sanchez is the mayor of Española in New Mexico. I should tell everybody I used to work for the state of New Mexico in the U.S. Senator Jeff Bingham's office, but not to take anything away from New Orleans. So let me just start with you, both of you, Mayor Cantrell and Mayor Sanchez, thanks for joining us. Look, when I asked my team to put this program together, I wanted to kind of say, take me to around the country, take me to places, big and small, to different communities, and let's hear what Americans want this town to hear, what they want the Biden administration to hear. So let's start with New Orleans. Mayor Cantrell, what do you think your constituents, your citizens in New Orleans most want to communicate right now about these times we're in and what they need?
Well, first of all, we definitely see a difference in the current administration willing to listen to mayors across the United States of America, which is promising. What we need, quite frankly, is that we have lost revenue. New Orleans is a destination city, very much concentrated on revenue driven by hospitality. And of course, that industry is suffering really big. But our municipalities, the city of New Orleans, again, has significant lost revenue because of the lack of sales tax revenue coming in. So we are really wanting to have Washington understand that it is our cities that need direct assistance. The CARES Act money, listen, you talked about the population of the city of New Orleans, but there was a threshold given at the start of this. It was 500,000 people. And if you did not meet that threshold, then your resources through CARES was funneled through your state. That happened here in the state of Louisiana, impacting New Orleans, where millions were rediverted and we did not get what we should have, over 200 million in lost revenue. And of course, expenses. This is the expenses we cannot even get reimbursed. Only 60 million have been reimbursed, and expenses continue to pile up. And of course, the loss of revenue, that divide continues to increase as well. Vaccinations, we need predictability consistently in terms of when we're going to get them, how much we're going to get, so that we can plan appropriately to get our people vaccinated. Housing, very much critical need. Jobs, of course, the unemployment has I mean, skyrocketed, over 44,000 of my people and growing by the day. Economic development. So all of these things are priorities. I know not just for the city of New Orleans, but as we look towards a road to recovery, all of these points are just prevalent.
Mayor, thank you for that. Mayor Sanchez, when I heard Mayor Cantrell basically talk about they didn't meet the threshold in the CARES package, that means you folks didn't either. I mean, are you also being hit very hard in terms of revenue and suspended financing because of COVID?
I think our situation is very similar to that of many small towns throughout the country. One of the things that we've noticed is just a small change in our GRTs, to be quite frank. And I think Mayor Cantrell really hit the nail on the head with regard to a new focus on economic development on a road to recovery. But one of the systemic issues that we will recognize financially and economically in our community is the fact that we are seeing a long-term shift away from small businesses to large businesses. And that's going to impact us in ways that we can't even recognize at the time. And I think that truly belies some of the seemingly not so large drops in GRT in our state, or at least in our community, because we're just shifting our purchases to literally 4 stores in our community. And they're important stores. They're Walmart, Lowe's, McDonald's, and Taco Bell, all of which have really seen skyrocketing numbers. But what we don't want to have happen long term is for customers, consumers, and businesses to accept that as a long-term model. We have to prepare and continue entrepreneurship as a road to recovery. We have to funnel as much money as we can to small businesses so that we can pull ourselves up from the bootstraps and recognize that after this is done, it's going to be the mom and pops, the people who don't have a voice right now. I listen to everybody on a daily basis. I'm a barber. Can I cut hair today? Are we open? There's a beautician or dry cleaners going out of business, and yet they're the ones who don't have a voice that larger businesses and corporations have. So, boots on the ground, what we hear are the daily stories and the struggles of people hurting economically. And, one of the things that we hear is, why are some lives more important than others? And without really getting into that discussion, what we have to recognize is what Governor Polis was saying, which is that this is multifaceted. We cannot escape physical health without thinking about emotional, social, and financial health as well.
One of the things, Mayor Sanchez, that I enjoyed reading about you, and I'm going to jump Mayor Cantrell, but I enjoyed your candor about some of the tough spots in your community, that you're pretty out there, in talking about the fact that there are folks with addiction struggles, opioids, alcoholism, and you say you gotta be honest about it, be there to kind of work on it. I guess my question is, as you look at the building blocks you have and the tools you have, and the way perhaps the federal government can be a help, what are some of those tools that would be helpful to deal with, poverty, which isn't going to go away overnight, which is going to deal with, addiction struggles? I just like to get a sense of, you can't control everything. And I'm a realist when it comes to that. But I also want to hear, just like Mayor Cantrell in New Orleans, very familiar with New Orleans. But what are those tools you say, wow, I wish I had a little bit more of this? What would that be?
That's a great question. And in fact, I posed that very same question to all of the service providers in our area. And I was thinking, hey, what if we had a detox center right in the middle of our town to really help with the people who need the services the most, so that we can create a quicker pipeline to the services that they need. And in the end, even that wasn't going to really solve too much, because there's a dearth of medical workers. And we see it throughout not only New Mexico, but throughout the country. We need professionals in the medical healthcare group, both for social services, but even at our hospitals. So we really need to improve a system that brings medical technicians as well as social workers into our communities. That's the only way that we're going to be able to help those who are most disparate and who are at the fringe of our society. And we talk about things like you mentioned, the problems that we have. We have a high drug and alcohol dependency in our area, and that has been going on for decades. We did a video on that last year, and it goes into detail. and it talks about the real problems that we have. And then we throw a pandemic like COVID on top. Where do we go from here? We have people who can't access the resources that they need. We have children who have been lost in the system, and we don't know where they are, and we're trying to recover them and bring them back into the fold. We've also read studies where if kids don't go into in-class learning by January, they're going to lose a whole year's worth of education. And over a lifetime, that's about a 4 to 5% cumulative lifetime earnings drop. We can't afford that in our community, and it's getting harder.
Well, Mayor Cantrell, I want to ask you the same question, but before I do, I want to share with people that you, after Hurricane Katrina, were president of the Broadmoor Improvement Association. One of the things I'm fascinated by, New Orleans hit so hard. Neighborhood redevelopment is not easy. It is really tough. Impacted lives, impacted jobs, just like Mayor Sanchez said. It impacts so many different areas systemically. And just as you share with us, what some of your struggles are and maybe some of the strengths, I'm interested in what you learned when you went from one crisis, because we're back in a crisis today, right? We're back in a turbulent storm, lots of different storms. Are there lessons learned that would be good to teach all of us when you're from Katrina to COVID to racial riots, racial tensions to inequality to the issues you deal with? What's your playbook?
Well, the first in the playbook is really listening to the people that you're in the position to serve, and really being boots on the ground, as you mentioned about Mayor Sanchez. You have to be, in the arena and on the ground with your people in order to advocate very sincerely about what their needs are. And there are many different needs, and the only way to know first is to know firsthand. And so listening and also advocating, I would say, but crises, we're definitely managing through a crisis here. The city of New Orleans is resilient. We definitely know how to move through and never lose hope. But it's by focusing again on where the needs are the greatest. And when you know your communities, when you know your constituency, then you should be able to tailor those responses. So, for example, when COVID hit, which came at a deficit in our community in terms of disparity gaps that already existed, well, we knew that. But being on the ground with our people, I had to move very quickly to mobilize testing sites in communities where the disparity gaps were even greater. So that's taking it to the people, going directly to them. And so we have to bring people along, continue to help them build hope and have hope, but they need to see you on the ground with them, listening and turning that into real action. And Mayor Sanchez hit it firsthand, in my opinion, a comprehensive approach, as it relates to economic development. Our small businesses are the backbone of our economy and our city, and they have been hit very hard, and especially in a destination city like New Orleans, where we have so many cultural bearers, our musicians, our artists. Many are 1099. They work from. It's a gig economy. They go from one to the next. So we really do need additional resources to meet our people where they are and to move them along.
Let me ask you both. I have no idea how you're going to answer this. A complicated question, maybe a delicate question. I think you're both in different political parties. We've just come through an election. There are a lot of divides in society. And I guess what I'm interested in is, what is the temperature? What is the willingness? What's the state of empathy inside a community? Are people spitting at each other, or are they willing to hear each other out and work together on problems? Is there something different and more toxic at the federal, national level than in communities? Are you finding your so I know it's a delicate question, but are you finding inside your communities people who may have resources able to help those that don't? Are you having those that don't understand that they got a so what's the, Mayor Sanchez, so I know it's a little delicate, but what's the situation in your world?
I don't think it's a delicate question at all. I think it's something that has to be approached on many levels. First and foremost, one of the challenges that we've had is navigating a world of complete juxtaposition. This last year has been so difficult, and trying to disseminate all of the information so that people have the correct information so that they can make decisions that are important to them and their families. That's been crucial. So that's number one. We have to inform everyone with accurate information, with up-to-date information, so that we know that we're all working from the same music sheet. What's really important and exciting about the year 2021 is that it gives us an opportunity to put 2020 behind us in so many ways and in so many perspectives. It's kind of like track and field. If you're looking at the hurdle that's in front of you, you're going to hit it. So what you need to do is put your vision and scope way beyond that and way in front of it, so that by the time you're jumping, you've already cleared that hurdle. And I think that's the way that we have to look at politics, because there's no way to get anything done if we all hide behind the veil of saying things like, that I'm doing what's right or I'm doing what's best. No, instead, what we really need to do is not toe the party line, but first and foremost, put our citizens' safety in perspective and put that number one. But along with that, physical safety, as we've mentioned before, we have to put first and foremost our social welfare and our economic financial stability at heart. I think we all want the same things. It's just a matter of trying to get there. That'll make it a little bit part of a dance. But I think that's something that we are here to do, and the way that we have to lead moving forward.
Thank you. Mayor Cantrell, let me ask you the same question.
Well, you know what? I think that we as elected leaders set the tone and the temperament for how we want our citizens to model and follow. In the city of New Orleans, it has been much of a shared sacrifice in this overall experience. And what we're kind of used to going through a crisis and going through it together. But in that spirit of shared sacrifice, it has also built the public trust to where they are listening, when I give guidelines and protocols for moving through this epidemic, this pandemic. We have been able to beat back, that curve, flatten that curve several times. And that's because that public trust, listening and following guidelines. Of course, it hasn't been easy, but it's about building the trust. And it does start with, again, listening to the people that you serve and being intentional about how you look through a lens of equity and ensuring that you're meeting them where they are, and regardless of where they are, but that they matter, and you dignify them in that type and with that type of response. I think it's about demonstrating that you can work together, that you can listen, and you can get things done. And right. I think the more that we do that, the better that we will be, not only as a city, as a state, but as a country. And this is the time. This is the moment in time. So I'm excited. I'm hopeful.
Well, that's powerful. I've got a question from our audience from Carrie Holloway, who's a banker with BNY Mellon. Carrie?
Will government use public-private partnerships to boost the economic recovery, i.e. partnering with community development financial institutions known as CDFIs?
Thank you for that. Let's go real quick on both of those. But Mayor Cantrell, I see you nodding your head.
Well, we can't do it without public-private partnerships, and especially working with our CDFI community, because access to capital and that cash, that liquidity is so invaluable as it relates to standing up small businesses that Mayor Sanchez spoke so highly about as well. So we cannot do it alone, and it's turning to those public-private partnerships. It's when you're in a city like New Orleans, when you don't have but one Fortune 500 company in your town, you really do have to turn to partnerships.
Well, thank you, Mayor Sanchez. Real quick, your thoughts.
There's no doubt that we have to bring in as many different resources as possible. Whether somebody can bring in the financing at a lower rate and somebody can actually be there to do the work, we have to work together. And there's no doubt that that's one of the ways that we're looking to move forward as well. You have to do an assessment of what's out there in order to know what you can achieve.
Well, Javier Sanchez, Mayor of Española, New Mexico, the land of enchantment. Great to have you on. Mayor Latoya Cantrell, Mayor of New Orleans, another world of enchantment. Thank you both for sharing your candid thoughts with us today.
Thank you for having.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And now it's time for... And now it's time for a message from the Bob Woodruff Foundation. Please welcome CEO Anne-Marie Doherty.
Good afternoon. My name is Anne-Marie Doherty, and I'm the CEO of the Bob Woodruff Foundation. Through our work at the foundation, I've witnessed the power of collaboration and collective impact. That's why we're proud to partner with The Hill today for Listening to America. It's a pivotal moment in our country. We have a lot of work ahead of us. If we're going to seize the opportunity to build back better, we have to really listen to our communities. For those of you who are meeting the Bob Woodruff Foundation for the first time right now, we've spent the past 15 years investing more than $76 million in creating healthy, positive futures for our veterans and their families. We invest time and resources in listening to the military and veteran community so that we can understand the most pressing issues they face, then prioritize and help address them. Through our grantees and local partners, we reach over 11 million veterans and families in hundreds of communities, rural, suburban, and urban, reaching from Alaska to Hawaii, Maine to Puerto Rico. We have partners in each of the states today's speakers represent, each community with its own unique strengths and struggles. In one community, veteran-serving organizations struggle to reach veterans who choose to live off the grid in wilderness in rural Colorado. In coastal Louisiana, where nearly 10,000 veterans work in pandemic-impacted industries, we partner with a local organization to provide legal services for veterans, some of whom still face long-term challenges from previous disasters. In Arizona and Alaska, our partners are collaborating with tribal governments and organizations to support the well-being of Native American veterans. Pre-pandemic, our data about our local partner network indicated trending needs in key areas: employment, mental health, and alcohol and substance abuse. Since COVID-19, the feedback from our network is clear. The needs have increased and the capacity has decreased. As we continue to listen to our network, we heard about an emerging and pervasive issue: food insecurity. In response, we launched a major granting and information campaign with the support of Craig Newmark Philanthropies. In the past 2 months alone, we've issued $250,000 in microgrants to help veterans put food on the table. And we'll be announcing more grants soon. And next week, February 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern, we're convening experts for the first part of our Leaders Eat Last panel series. The Bob Woodruff Foundation has invested in cross-sector collaboration for years. We know that when diverse and committed stakeholders come to the table, we can turn the tide on our toughest challenges. I'm grateful to be at this table with the illustrious speakers today, less than a week after an historic inauguration. What a great opportunity to come together, even if we can't actually be together, to listen to America and learn from one another. I look forward to hearing from you all today.
Anne-Marie, thank you, and thanks for supporting today's program. The Biden-Harris administration put together so far, well, I guess it's beyond so far, the most diverse cabinet in history. And even though there are more diverse voices in national offices than ever before, will traditionally underserved groups be heard? We're now joined by the leaders of 3 diverse Native and Indigenous communities in the United States. Dale Sambo Doro, am I getting that right? Doro, yes. A native Inuit from Alaska is the international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the ICC. It represents approximately 180,000 Inuit in the Arctic, including Alaska. Fascinating. I can't wait to connect. Hailama Farden is the president of the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, the oldest Hawaiian community-based advocacy movement that works for the welfare of Native Hawaiians. And Dr. Alicia Musso is the recently elected vice president of the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe of South Dakota. She's focused on bringing health equity, research, programming, and awareness to tribal communities. Really so grateful to all of you. Folks, I've been sitting in this chair today, kind of stuck here for hours and hours and hours. Every once I've got my computer here popping up, and I'm on the Biden's media team, and it's been popping all day with new executive orders from President Biden on basically saying we need to engage and recognize and really take seriously engagement with tribal councils. We need to remove any element of discrimination of Asians and Pacific Islanders. And so we're right in that space that we're talking about today, and stuff is unfolding as we talk about it. So let me just start out with Alicia for a moment and say, is this promising for you, but is basically getting people on the cabinet and putting out executive orders enough? What is the meat that you want to see in terms of different moves from this administration?
Yeah, so, we've been waiting, right?
Right.
Since the beginning. We're the first peoples of this nation. And so we've been waiting for these conversations. And we hear honor the treaties, and we're doing more land acknowledgements now. But, how about we honor the people and do acknowledgements of the people? So we're waiting, we're excited, and we're ready to have those conversations.
Are you sensing among the people that you represent, and you represent diversity and across a lot of areas, but do you sense that there's a sense of change, that this is an inflection point?
We've been waiting. I'll just keep saying that, for the conversations, for the change. We do the work here in our communities and for our people as much as we can. We do, and everyone is doing the best they can with what they have right now, especially given the pandemic. But some of these things that the pandemic has opened up and shown us in our systems, including the systemic racism things, we've felt that since the beginning. These systems were not made for us and by us, and we have been trying to make do with them as best we can since people came to this country. We've been here. And so we've been trying to work with them and make them more user-friendly for us, given our sovereignty and our ability to do that. But I'm excited to see it happen on a national level, to be honest.
Thank you for that. Daly, Arctic Indigenous peoples, this is an arena of much stress right now. There's climate change. There are issues about not having engagement, not being out there. And I'm just interested in how you see this moment. And what do you think, there's a lot of folks listening right now, what do you think we need to hear that we're not hearing? What are the blind spots when it comes to working with the community and working on, I hate this calling your community, working on the issue of ignoring people, of bigotry, of racism, of not seeing people that are there?
Thank you for the question. I think that Alicia is right, that many of these issues have been chronic and persistent for Indigenous peoples across North America, the Pacific, and elsewhere. And from the Arctic region, I think that the initial signals of this new administration, the Biden administration, are very hopeful that there is some light on the horizon, especially when you consider the recent appointments, especially Deb Haaland as the Secretary of Interior. This is a sign of hope. But back to what Alicia said, the issues that we've been facing since first contact have been chronic and persistent. And for the Arctic region, you are dead on. The impacts of climate change are dramatic and they're significant, and they're contributing to many interrelated conditions for our communities. Also, Alicia's reference to the pandemic, I think that we have seen the reveal of some of these chronic issues, especially in the Arctic, where many of our communities are remote, rural, coastal communities where we have faced an infrastructure deficit for decades. And this was prior to the pandemic.
Right.
They've been much more acute in the pandemic. If we think about matters like potable water, if we think about matters like actual healthcare facilities, when you hold that up against the backdrop of a global pandemic, and you expect people to make do with what they have, many across America need to understand that what our communities don't have is the basic infrastructure to respond to these issues. And on your point about climate change. I think that it is absolutely imperative that the rest of the nation, as well as the global community, understand the dramatic impacts of climate change upon our people who have been reliant upon the sea ice and the marine environment and all of the different the realization of all of the different cascading impacts upon our communities, including food insecurity. So there are a host of different issues facing Arctic Indigenous peoples, a host of different issues facing Inuit communities, and that light on the horizon, I hope that our communities see the concrete results through this administration to close some of these gaps and also engage directly with us as to what our priorities are and our solutions are to the challenges that we continue to face.
I really appreciate that. I want to share. I'm also hopeful in Deb Haaland's appointment as Secretary of the Interior. I had the privilege of interviewing her a few weeks ago, right on this show, about some of these same issues. And I always think that there's this interesting potential gap, and you'll just have to excuse me. There's this Japanese term called tatemae and honne. Tatemae is the surface, honne is the reality, the deep core, and there could be a big difference. But the question is, when you see somebody appointed to this, can they deliver? And I'm very hopeful that she really gets the agenda that needs to be put in place on all of these, and we'll see. But Hailama, I cannot remember a time. I have been very interested in Hawaii for so long, but I was also aware that there is this a kind of internal discrimination, if you will, at least that's the way I put it, a neglect of Native Hawaiians in Hawaii. And I know you've been working in that on housing, on opportunity, on businesses across the board. I'm a big fan of what you've been trying to do. I guess I would ask you a question of, one, why has it been so hard? Why is this problem, which has been there for so long, so hard to fix? And two, what do you want America to hear? What do you want the Biden administration to hear?
Before I begin, I'd like to thank you. And he hano hano ke ia ku'uno ana me olua, Dr. Duro, Dr. Maso. It is my honor to serve here today with you all. And I thank you. Just quickly, because I know our time is short, I could spend hours talking about a plight of Native Hawaiian people. I could spend hours and tell you how poorly we have been serviced and served. And I know that you can find that information. America, you can find that information. And I'll be always willing to engage with any of you on this. We had a kingdom. We are a very successful kingdom established by King Kamehameha I. And on top of that, we established one of, if not the first, Department of Education in the world. And our king declared this would be a literate nation back in the 1830s and 40s. We had the first newspaper west of the Rockies, actually, first school west of the Rockies, first newspaper west of the Missouri, and even farther. 1 million leaves of newspaper continue, and they're all written in Hawaiian. And so when I think about the plight of the Native Hawaiians, which in many cases are similar to our Alaska Natives, as well as our First People, First Nations folks in the United States, there are similarities. We have some others too. But yes, Governor Polis earlier spoke of the multidimensional tragedy in its connection to COVID. I'll tell you that is one of the dimensions of the tragedies and pilikia or problems that we face as Native Hawaiians. So I'd rather spend some time to say, what are we going to do? I think we have a great opportunity here. I too support President Biden's nomination to Representative Haaland, and that I have very high hopes that something will be happening. Imagine, why did it take so long for a Native person to be nominated and we're hoping to be selected? On top of that, we need to be together, the Native Indigenous people of what is now the United States of America. We need to work together. We need to connect with each other. We probably need to be more civically engaged. We need to find ways to address some of the major areas, like you said, education, native health and well-being and housing. great opportunities in the civic level, in the government level, economic level especially. Why not lift our people up? And you know what's good about putting our people up there in offices and serving is that our people are very inclusive. We will always include and not exclude. That's not what we were taught. And I know our colleagues here would agree to that. So that would be my answer. Let's start working together and let's draft legislation and congressional acts or laws. Let's start working as a people together, bringing in all walks of life, all races that are here, and Indigenous and you call them, let's say Native folks throughout the world, and bring us together, because we'll help the world, we'll heal the world.
That's wonderful. Let me ask the three of you, starting with Alicia. I don't know how this is going to come out. Sometimes I ask questions, I don't know where they're going to go, but I guess, I've done so many events and editorial moments on things like clinical trials in cancer, or listening to folks about COVID. Tomorrow I'm interviewing Anthony Fauci about how the vaccine rollout's going out, how trials and involvement. And one of the things you look at about COVID, the impact on communities of color, certain communities, a lot of it is oriented around income and race. But then when you kind of look at it and you really get into it, there's an absence of social trust. There's a fear that somehow in some communities that science is there. And the way around that is communications. It's ambassadors. It's embracing people that the Indigenous, Inuit community would trust, or the, Indigenous Native American community would trust, or the Asian Pacific Islander community would trust. And I guess my friendly critique of the government right now is I'm not sure those ambassadors are there. So let me just ask each of you, what would you do if you were in charge to create a greater bridge of social trust? So when it came to cancer, when it came to dealing with climate change, when it came to deal with, COVID stuff, when it came to, various other, programs and policies out there, that there was less skepticism and more trust. I don't know if that's an unfair question, Alicia, but I'm going to start with you.
I think having your own people be the scientists, be the experts, that definitely helps to build the trust. I'm a scientist by training as well, and so I can help to convey some of those messages to our community. But I also know our community we have traditional, people who know our traditional ways, and they may not have a PhD from a university, but they have a PhD in traditional knowledge in our community, in our culture, in our history, and so they're just as important. So I think it's also creating that mutual respect and understanding of education and knowledge, and how can we all use that to help our community understand some of those Western ways of knowing as well, and also having the Western ways of knowing understand our traditional ways of knowing and not make them two separate things, because there are a lot of parallels you can make in both of those things, in medicines and treatments and things like that. It just takes that time of creating that understanding and building those bridges, like you said, from our community ways of knowing and traditional ways of knowing and those Western ways of knowing, and also creating that pipeline for our students and our community members to get those degrees and bring that knowledge back and build that base for them to come back in jobs and careers in our communities, specifically in our communities.
Thank you for that. I love the scaffolding that you just gave this. But Daly?
Yeah. I think that what you've hit on in terms of trust and respect and recognition, that this is at the core of all of the future dialogues that we need to have to get to the point that Hailama has outlined in terms of working together. And Alicia's comments just now about the importance of Indigenous knowledge. And really it comes to real trust, real respect, real recognition, the genuine sentiment of that, the embrace of Indigenous peoples through dialogue and genuine outreach and discussion of the issues that face our communities. And from my point of view, much of this does really come back to recognizing and respecting Indigenous peoples and their values, their practices, their customs, their institutions, everything about us as distinct peoples who have a desire to maintain our cultural identity and everything that makes up our cultural identity. There's there's so much work to do in every area, whether it's health and healthcare, whether it's the dealing with the impacts of climate change, whether it is in relation to education, or our ability to define and determine our own priorities for our development within our communities, whether it's economic development, social development, cultural development, spiritual development, whatever it happens to be. And I guess to a large extent, I'm really saying the full recognition of and respect for our right of self-determination as distinct people so that we can occupy that political and intellectual space and make the extraordinary contributions that we can make as Indigenous peoples. I really appreciate what Alicia has said about Indigenous knowledge and the importance of Indigenous knowledge. If we're going to tackle these issues within our communities, our leadership, our knowledge holders, and others have to be brought to the table in a meaningful, effective, and to a large degree, an urgent fashion in order for us to begin those dialogues and make the contributions that we can. I think that your earlier question, which I failed to respond to in terms of discrimination and the issue of equality, the rest of the world community needs to recognize that in order to gain equality in relation to Indigenous peoples, whether they're Inuit throughout Chakaka, Alaska, Canada, or Greenland, or Haudenosaunee, or Native Hawaiian people, is to really embrace everything about us, including and specifically our right of self-determination. And I guess that's what I think is very hopeful in terms of Deb Haaland, as well as the others that she may identify to assist her in our future work. But direct outreach and direct engagement and understanding that equality means something different in the Indigenous context.
Well, and thank you for that. And Hailama, I want to, ask you to just, if we can answer that question of, social trust, but just tack on there. What is going to be the real dividing line in terms of how you see the Biden administration, which has come in, getting it right or getting it wrong? So I hate to put the pressure on you. This is our last word, but I'm putting it on you. So.
A lot of pressure. We need to be at the table. I think, first of all, when the rest of the Western world was fearing sea monsters and that they'd fall off the side, our peoples were sailing the Pacific. We were. And not fearful, we knew that we were guided. And on top of that, I would say we carried that excellence all the way until 1893, when there was the illegal armed invasion of Hawaii by the United States Marines and some other folks here. And folks read about it. Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen tells the story of what happened to Hawaii. People don't know. On top of that, we have to seize the opportunities. I spoke already about health and well-being of our people. I spent this morning, because I ended last night talking to an elder about how his brother doesn't have access to a computer and thus not even able to connect to a sign-on registration. And when he calls the number that's provided, the number's always busy. So I spent the morning speaking to one of our doctors, our Native Hawaiian doctors. So what can we do? And we're trying to figure out some ways of getting our people easy accessibility. We spent much of the early 1900s being told, be good Americans and don't disrespect, don't make waves. Well, it's time for us to make waves. And we don't have to be rude about it. We've never been. It's time for us to take our ownership of our responsibility where we were as a people and stand. I represent 60 clubs from Hawaii all the way to Washington, D.C. And our organization has been doing political work. We have been doing cultural work and spiritual. I love the ideas brought out by Dr. DeRoe. And I would like to pledge to work with both of you as well as our other colleagues to continue lifting our peoples. And because when we are doing well, the world will do well. I continue to promise that. So get us into positions. Now, I also will say as a last caveat, I represent the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs. We have many definite, wonderful Native Hawaiian leaders that should be connecting with you, as well as the perspective. There's a divided perspective. One is that some folks are very okay with being United States citizens, and there's some folks who are saying the kingdom has never been surrendered. And officially at the federal level, we are not a part of the 574 federally recognized tribes. We are not a recognized people in the United States. In other words, I don't exist, so maybe I should have been on this show. But
you should definitely be
no
on
one
this
has to
show.
tell me from a Western perspective I don't exist, because I'm here and I exist, and we do too. And we're here to work together.
Well, listen,
Aloha nui.
I'm so grateful to all of you, and I want to apologize for something. This is our first conversation that I know, and I just want to say thank you for coming on, and let's continue the conversation. We don't always have to talk about this particularly. What I find interesting, and particularly listening to Daly, listening to our scientist Alicia, there are lots of other issues. I don't want to typecast anybody, and I want to have you back so we can continue this conversation and not just do it today and say, okay, let's do it. So let's make a commitment that we can all continue this conversation down the road on a lot of other fronts. I'm very honored that you were here today. So, Hailama Farden, President of the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, Alicia Musso, Vice President of the Oglala Lakota Sioux Tribe, and Daly Sambo Doro, please excuse me for my mispronunciations, International Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. I really appreciate your time and being here. Thank you so much. Our final guest on this listening tour of America will help us understand the societal, political, and historical ramifications of where we find ourselves today. Dr. Peniel Emmaus Joseph is the Barbara Jordan Chair, and I should say Barbara Jordan is awesome. She's so lucky to have this chair, and founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Peniel, so glad to meet you, and thank you for joining us today in our listening tour, right, to listen to her. Let me just start with the fact that I've been interviewing someone I have a lot of respect for, Dr. Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign. And I've done now, I think, 3 interviews with him and looked at his interaction, and he's very candid. He's played a role in the inauguration activities, but he said, look, we don't just automatically sign up for the Biden campaign. We don't automatically sign up for these people. We want to see results for people in the street, not just for the black community. There are people that are having trouble across the board. He's a very, very inclusive guy in what he thinks about what needles need to be moved and pushed. And I sort of like that. And so I want to ask you, in the spirit of Dr. Barber, whom I really respect your work as well. And I should mention, everyone, read his book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, named one of Time Magazine's 100 most read books of 2020. So let's push that out there. But what would you think to make this a real moment about what can change for Americans and what you expect from the Biden administration? What do they need to hear?
Well, I think it's an all of the above strategy, and we've been hearing it so far. A lot of this is related to COVID-19 and the pandemic, and there's a massive economic recession and crisis happening right here, but that's disproportionately impacting communities of color. And I saw the last panel, Indigenous activists were very, very eloquent about that fact. So it's a few things. It's passing this $1.9 trillion stimulus package, which the administration says would lift 40% of Latinos out of poverty, 33% of African Americans out of poverty. It's really having some kind of universal basic income program in the United States, irrespective of race. It's passing voting rights legislation, John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It's really investing more in terms of housing affordability and food justice and racial desegregation, both in terms of housing, but also neighborhoods and public schools. For healthcare, Medicare for all, or some kind of guaranteed national healthcare system would help everyone, especially those who are very, very poor. And then finally, 2 things, climate change and the criminal justice system. Climate change is an existential crisis that impacts all of us. The criminal justice system, as we've seen with George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, really represents a gateway to panoramic systems of oppression that disproportionately impact Black people and communities of color. And we saw that in the aftermath of the white supremacist insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, if we just see the way in which the white supremacist racial terrorists have been treated after desecrating the Capitol, in contrast, at times peaceful demonstrators, you see that we have two tiers of justice in this country that has to dramatically change. So it needs President Biden and Vice President Harris, they need an all of the above strategy. And so far, less than a week into the administration, that's what we're seeing.
Let me ask you, you raised the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd's murder, and there were honestly many other murders out there. And, again, I'm speaking subjectively. My sense is that the conversation has changed from being one about what do we do about police brutality, what do we do about, the way officers were trained and, getting an equation of social justice right in a community, to something about what the Black Lives Matter protests did. I mean, somehow it's turned into the marchers and the protests as opposed to there. After, some of the protests began, I interviewed former Governor Chris Christie about Camden, New Jersey. And he said, in Camden, New Jersey, we had a real problem. We had a rotten police department. We had to take it down, to the bottom. We had to get rid of a lot of officers. We had to create retraining. Val Demings I had on shortly after, she said the same thing. I don't know about you, but my sense is I don't see any of that going on. Do you see much movement about the fundamental issue that was driving a lot of the concern about, the way police are trained, about the holds, about racism in departments, and about training?
Well, yes, the more radical investing in communities rather than investing in police, sometimes people call it defund the police. They just really mean reimagining public safety. We've seen at the local level in terms of even in my hometown here of Austin, Texas.
So you see progress in that?
Yes, there's been progress at the local level, reallocation. But what we haven't seen is the massive criminal justice reform that we would need. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act doesn't go far enough, but it would take more steps. President Biden is going to be announcing a national commission to study, but we need more than that. We've been having studies of police since 1919, at least, when there was a white riot in Chicago that murdered scores of Black people, and the police sided with the white rioters and also murdered Black people. So that was the first time we had a real commission or study. And since then, we've had studies, the McCone Report after the Watts Rebellion in 1965. We had the Kerner Commission under President Johnson, which said the society was white, Black, separate, hostile, and unequal, and blamed the urban riots and rebellions on systemic racism. We've had reports after Rodney King in 1992 and after Ferguson in Baltimore in 2015. So this has to end. So we need congressional action. I think part of what's happening in the country is we've seen our democratic institutions failing us. So we need reform even within the institutions, the Senate and the filibuster. There's so much in the way in which Americans are being held hostage. They passed a $2 trillion stimulus for big business when the pandemic started, but they didn't pass it for ordinary working people and the homeless. And it's the same under Trump. The tax cuts were a massive giveaway to the wealthiest corporations and the wealthiest people in the United States at the expense of the poor. And that's what Reverend Barber talks about as well. So we've seen some headway, but we need a lot more. I think the positive of the Biden-Harris administration is that they recognize the catastrophic crisis that we're in, because we're really in a crisis between race inequality, democracy, and white supremacy. And the only way you can temper that crisis is by centering racial justice and really by trying to eradicate systemic racism, defeat white supremacy that we see flourishing to the detriment of all of us, because the assault on the nation's capital is an assault on all of us who are Americans.
Peniel, when I was at The Atlantic, one of my colleagues was Ta-Nehisi Coates. He wrote an incredibly powerful piece calling for reparations for slavery, and that when it came to assets, when it came to the long line of bigotry, systemic racism in finance and home ownership and voting, all of these things, so we need reparations. So where are you on reparation? And do you think there is a difference, a line between, I don't know what to call it, but the easy, low-hanging fruit for the Biden administration of saying, hey, we're not racist, we're going to think about all this stuff, and something big like reparations?
Well, I think certainly they're centering racial justice and trying to make the federal government, all its agencies do racial data audits and to be anti-racist, which is great. I'm for reparations. I think we should have by executive order, a national racial truth, justice and healing commission, where the truth means that we get our story straight finally so we can share with our kids the grandeur and the travails of American democracy. We've been bogged down in the myths of American exceptionalism and having to lie about ourselves as a country for far too long. This country has been based on two big lies. The first lie was during antebellum racial slavery that said that Black people were this species of property. They were legal contraband that white people could own in perpetuity forever. The Supreme Court said the same thing in the Dred Scott case in 1857. 700,000 Americans had to die to turn the corner on that lie. Unfortunately, from Reconstruction to the present, we've doubled down on a second big lie, which is that the first one never happened. So we say things like affirmative action, or even the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction after racial slavery was some kind of special privilege rather than public policy to actually guarantee and achieve Black citizenship and dignity. So when we think about racial truth, getting our story straight, justice is what? Policies. President has done executive orders. Those are great. They're not enough. We need legislation. What I loved about Biden today was he was reminding me of LBJ. LBJ is the last president that we've had. He's not perfect. He was flawed. But the Great Society is an important grand vision. FDR had the same thing with the four freedoms, right? So when we think about where we're at today, executive orders are going to be very, very important. But we need the massive kind of legislation that we saw with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, much of which has been lost because of the Shelby Holder decision of 2013. So the positive is that Biden is thinking big, but what we're seeing is that our democratic system in Congress might be too broken to actually legislate the will of the people. 81 million people wanted the Biden-Harris administration, biggest number of popular votes in American history, and that was despite voter suppression, especially targeted and weaponized against Black people. We have a Supreme Court that's 6-3 because Republicans weaponized the filibuster and deprived Merrick Garland and Democrats of a rightful seat on the court. All of that matters. So what Biden's trying to do is sort of prove that democracy is not broken, but we have one major party, the GOP, that is not interested in voting rights, that is not interested in democracy, that is siding with insurrectionists and siding with treason publicly and white supremacy. So we're in trouble nationally, despite the warm feelings about the inauguration, because it's very difficult to have a democracy where half the voting population wants authoritarian fascism. So it's very, very difficult. But the positive is that Biden is at least thinking big, and the press conference he did today talking about racial justice and centering racial justice. And if we can do that, that lifts us all up was spot on. And that's sort of the best words president has said about this since Lyndon Johnson.
Very powerful. I mean, I mentioned earlier, my computer's been popping all day with these new executive statements, executive memoranda, of course, the executive order across a whole variety of different race and identity issues. Just very quick, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you'll come back. But I look at these as an opportunity. We don't all know everything about each other. That's why I wanted to have a listening tour. But you're the Barbara Jordan Chair, and I don't know if everybody knows Barbara Jordan, but I want them to have an opportunity. Will you please tell our audience about how awesome Barbara Jordan was?
Well, Barbara Jordan is the first Black woman to represent the South, 1972 election, 1973 to 79 in U.S. Congress. She was the first Black woman to be a Texas state legislator starting in 1966 from Houston. She taught for 17 years at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where I teach from 1979 to 1996 rather. And really her big piece of co-sponsored legislation is the 1975 voting rights extension. And what that did is include Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, folks who were minority language but predominant in their own locales. You had to give them voting rights and access as well. And that extension puts Texas under the VRA in the Southwest from 1975 to 2013. And of course, very famously, Barbara Jordan has the eloquent and elegant words, both at the 1974 Watergate hearings, where she talks about her faith in the Constitution, how it's whole, it's complete, and she wouldn't allow the Nixon administration to desecrate the Constitution. And she becomes the first Black keynote speaker at a major party political convention in 1976. Barbara Jordan paves the way for Barack Obama. She paved the way for Kamala Harris. She paves the way for modern Black elected officials who are interested in racial justice and democracy, who believe in voting rights, and who believe in the promise of America at its very, very best. So Barbara Jordan is one of the heroic freedom fighters of the 20th century whose legacy continues to reverberate, not just in Texas, but nationally.
Thank you for that. I'm so glad you shared that about the great Barbara Jordan. So Dr. Peniel Emmaus Joseph, the Barbara Jordan Chair and Founding Director of the Center for Study of Race and Democracy at UT Austin, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll be back.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. What a great set of conversations. A big thank you to the Bob Woodruff Foundation for supporting this program and all of you in the audience for joining us. For those of you who missed any conversations, these are conversations you ought to go back and listen to again and again and again. They'll all be on our website shortly. Join us tomorrow for a double header. We're going to talk small business at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, and then at 1:15 p.m. Eastern, it's time for the Vaccine Summit. Time for everything you wanted to know about the COVID vaccine, but didn't know who to ask. Dr. Anthony Fauci will be joining us, also Dr. Francis Collins, as well as many other fantastic speakers. Go to thehill.com/events to sign up. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.